An absent grandfather is given the unexpected opportunity to meet his grandson for the first time. But upon arriving at the restaurant, his heart stops. Standing before him is Elisa, the love of his life he could never forget. What secrets from the past are about to change everything? Roberto looked at himself in the mirror as he adjusted the knot of his tie with trembling hands. The reflection gave him back the image of a man with hair sprinkled with gray, with a face that hid or tried to hide decades of decisions that now weighed on his shoulders. He sighed deeply. That night was different. That night, the past finally knocked on his door. It had been years since his relationship with his son had fractured. Memories of his abrupt departure and the arguments that had separated them continued to haunt him, especially on silent nights when solitude was his only company. But now that same son had extended an unexpected gesture, a message with an invitation to meet his grandson, Samuel, whom he had never met. Roberto accepted, though the decision filled him with mixed emotions. How can you fix something so broken? As he prepared to leave, he couldn't help but reflect on the lost years and how pride and hasty decisions had brought him to this point. He had been a successful businessman, known for his determination and strong character, but deep down he knew he had failed at what really mattered. Sitting on the bed with the invitation in his hands, he allowed his mind to wander to the happy moments of his youth. He thought of Elisa, the woman who had once been the center of his life, and how his decisions had also ruined that love. Although he had not thought of her for decades, that memory washed over him like an unexpected wave. What had become of her? Had she found the happiness he could not offer her? Shaking off those thoughts, Roberto focused on the immediate. Meeting his grandson was an opportunity he couldn't afford to waste. It was as if fate had given him a second chance, a small crack in the barrier of time to reconcile with his past. Before leaving, she picked up an old photograph of her son as a child. Maybe Samuel looks like him, she thought, her fingers tenderly running across the frame. She tucked the photo into her jacket pocket like a talisman, a reminder of what she was about to face. The trip to the restaurant was silent. The city seemed colder that night, or perhaps it was his own nervousness that made him perceive everything more intensely. Upon arriving, Roberto paused for a moment in front of the door, breathing deeply to calm his anxiety. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt so afraid, and at the same time, a faint hope that shone in some corner of his heart. With slow steps, he entered the restaurant. The warm murmur of conversation and the soft clink of glasses greeted him. The atmosphere was cozy, but his attention was on something else. It was time to face everything he had left behind. Translated from Spanish to English. www.onlinedoctranslator.com. Roberto sat down at a table near a window, from where he could see the street lit by the yellow lights of the street lamps. As he waited, he couldn't help but feel overcome by a whirlwind of emotions. It had been so long since he sat down with someone from his family that this place, although cozy, seemed strange to him. The restaurant had a warm, familiar atmosphere, with the murmur of conversation and laughter filling the air. The walls decorated with old paintings and wooden shelves gave it a nostalgic feel. Roberto, however, barely paid attention to the details. His mind was occupied with thoughts of his son and grandson. She allowed herself to imagine what Samuel would be like. Will he be as restless as his father was when he was a child? Will he look at me with curiosity or suspicion? She thought, as she fiddled with a metal spoon on the table. Questions swirled in her head, increasing her anxiety. To distract himself, he watched the couples and families around him. A young couple laughed over dessert, while at another table, a group of friends toasted excitedly. It all seemed so simple and natural to everyone else. But for Roberto, every minute of waiting was a reminder of the decades he had lost. Suddenly, his gaze fell on a figure across the restaurant. It was a woman with light brown hair, tied back in a simple bun, who sat with her back to him. There was something about his posture, the way he tilted his head as he spoke, that seemed strangely familiar. Her heart skipped a beat, and for a moment she forgot her initial nervousness. Elisa. That name passed through his mind like a whisper, as if the wind had brought it from some corner of his memory. It couldn't be her, he thought, shaking his head to clear the thought. It was impossible. After all these years, what were the chances of finding her in this place? and yet something inside him told him to look again. Unable to resist, he looked at her more closely. Although distance and years played against him, the way she moved her hands when she spoke, the slight turn of her head when she listened, were details he recognized. Roberto felt a tickle in his chest, a mixture of surprise, nostalgia, and something he couldn't quite identify. Suddenly, the woman turned slightly, leaving her face partially visible. It was enough for a torrent of memories to flood Roberto's mind. Elisa, the woman who had marked his life in such a profound way, was sitting there, so close and yet so distant. He stood still, gripping the spoon tightly as if it could anchor him to reality. His mind tried to find a logical explanation. Maybe it was someone similar, a simple coincidence. But in his heart, he knew it wasn't. The voices in the restaurant seemed to fade away as his thoughts dragged him to another time, another place where Elisa was the center of his world. A wave of emotions ran through him: joy, pain, regret, and an unexpected spark of hope. As the clock ticked away, Roberto realized that this meeting was not just a family reunion. Something else was about to change in his life. And although he didn't know exactly what, he felt he couldn't ignore it. Roberto couldn't look away. Although doubts continued to plague his mind, every gesture, every movement of that woman convinced him more that she was Elisa. The Elisa he had loved with an intensity he could never repeat. The Elisa who had become the greatest what-if of his life. His heart was pounding, but he also felt a weight on his chest. If it was really her, what did that mean? Would she be willing to talk to him? Would she hold a grudge for the decisions that separated them? So many years had passed, and time had a way of transforming people, erasing or sometimes deepening wounds. As he tried to process what he was seeing, his thoughts dragged him back in time. It was impossible not to remember the first time he saw her, in a park filled with spring flowers. She was sitting on a bench, reading a book with a peaceful smile on her face. At that moment, Roberto had felt like the world had stopped. Over time, that connection grew into something deeper, stronger, something he believed unbreakable. But life had other plans. His ambition and desire to build a future led him to make decisions that distanced him from Elisa. When he was offered a position in another city, he accepted without thinking too much, convinced that she would understand and follow him eventually. But Elisa didn't. Her life, her roots were there, and Roberto didn't know how to handle that conflict. What began as small arguments ended in an inevitable separation. He shook his head, trying to get back to the present. This was no time to get lost in memories. Elisa was there, on the other side of the restaurant, and the possibility of getting closer filled him with unease. But there was something else holding him back. The young man sitting with her, the boy in his early 20s, seemed comfortable in her company, laughing with her as if they shared a special bond. Who was he? A son? A nephew? The thought of Elisa having started a family in his absence struck him with a pang of jealousy and sadness, though he knew he had no right to feel that. As he struggled with his emotions, Roberto felt a flash of unexpected hope. Maybe this meeting wasn't a coincidence. Maybe after so many years of regret and unanswered questions, fate was offering him a chance to close that chapter, or even rewrite it. She looked back in his direction, trying to decide what to do. On one hand, she feared that coming closer might open up old wounds, both for her and for him. On the other, she knew that if she didn't, she would probably spend the rest of her life wondering what had happened. Elisa looked up for a moment, and although she didn't seem to have seen him, Roberto felt as if time had stopped again. That spark in her eyes, that warmth he remembered so well, was still there, intact despite the years. Emotions overwhelmed him. He knew he was about to make a decision that could change everything. And even though fear enveloped him, he also felt a strange comfort. After all, it's not every day that the past gives you a second chance. Roberto took a deep breath, trying to calm the whirlwind of emotions that was overwhelming him. After a few moments of hesitation, he decided to act. Slowly, he got up from his seat, adjusted the collar of his jacket, and began to walk toward the table where Elisa was. Each step seemed to lengthen time, as if the world was conspiring to increase his nervousness. When they were a few meters away, Elisa casually turned her head, and suddenly their eyes met. Time seemed to stop. Her eyes, those same eyes that had once looked at him with so much love, recognized him instantly. An expression of surprise appeared on her face, followed by a mixture of emotions that were difficult to decipher. "Roberto?" she asked almost in a whisper. "Hello, Elisa," he replied, trying hard to keep his voice calm. The young man sitting next to her looked at them curiously, oblivious to the intensity of the moment. Elisa slowly sat up, as if she still couldn't believe what she was seeing. Roberto noticed that her hands were shaking slightly, and that moved him more than he expected. "It's, unexpected to see you here," Elisa said, regaining some composure. Roberto nodded, not knowing how to explain the coincidence of this meeting. Before he could answer, the young man stood up, breaking the moment of tension. "Grandma, who is he?" the boy asked, with a mixture of curiosity and caution. Grandma. That word echoed in Roberto's mind, clearing up part of the enigma. Elisa gave the young man a brief smile before turning to Roberto. "Roberto, this is Samuel," she said with a warmth that I had not expected. Then looking at the boy, she added, "Samuel, this is your grandfather." Roberto's world turned upside down for a moment. He hadn't imagined that the young man Elisa was sharing the table with was his own grandson. He looked at Samuel closely, noticing the familiar features on his face, the shape of his eyes, the gesture of his smile. It was like looking at his son in a younger version. "Samuel," Roberto said, his voice barely breaking. The young man looked at him with some curiosity, but also with reservation. He didn't seem upset, but there was something in his expression that revealed an attempt to understand the situation. Roberto, for his part, felt a torrent of emotions: joy, guilt, nervousness. "I've waited a long time to meet you," Roberto continued, trying to control his voice. Samuel nodded slightly but said nothing more. Elisa, sensing the tension in the air, intervened softly. "Samuel, why don't you order us something else to drink?" she suggested, pointing to the restaurant bar with a smile. The young man took the hint and stood up without protest. When he was out of earshot, Elisa looked at Roberto again, this time with a mixture of nostalgia and caution. "I didn't think I'd ever see you again," she said, her voice carrying a trace of sadness. "I didn't expect this either, Elisa," Roberto replied, "but I'm glad to be here." The conversation paused for a few seconds as they both tried to process the unexpected turn the evening had taken. Elisa nervously played with a pendant she was wearing around her neck, and Roberto recognized it instantly. It was the same necklace he had given her so many years ago. "You still have it," he murmured, unable to hide his surprise. Elisa looked at him, and for a brief moment, the barrier of time seemed to fade away. Samuel returned to the table with 3 glasses on a tray, momentarily interrupting the exchange of glances between Roberto and Elisa. He placed the glasses in front of each of them and sat down again, looking at his grandfather with renewed curiosity. "So," Samuel began, breaking the silence, "are you really my grandfather?" The question was direct, but there was no trace of reproach in his tone. Rather, it seemed a mixture of fascination and caution. Roberto smiled, though somewhat shyly. "Yes, Samuel, I'm your grandfather. I'm sorry I wasn't there before." Samuel watched him closely as if trying to decipher him. Elisa remained silent, allowing them to begin a conversation that she knew was important to both of them. "My dad doesn't talk about you much," Samuel admitted, shrugging. "I just know that you lived far away for a long time." Roberto nodded, accepting the comment with resignation. He knew that his son had not given him a place in Samuel's life, and he couldn't blame him. "It's true, I was far away, too far away. But I'd like to change that if you'll allow me," said Roberto with a sincerity that surprised even himself. Samuel thought for a few seconds. He didn't seem upset, but he wasn't entirely sure how to respond either. Finally, he nodded with a slight smile. "I guess we can try. I've always wanted to know more about my family." Samuel's words filled Roberto with hope. It wasn't a complete acceptance, but it was a start. Elisa, who had remained silent until that moment, let out an almost imperceptible sigh, as if she shared Roberto's relief. "What do you like to do, Samuel?" Roberto asked, trying to get closer to his grandson. The young man seemed to relax at the question and began to talk about his interests. He was studying engineering, He was passionate about classic films, and he had a special interest in music, although he confessed that he was not particularly good at playing any instrument. As he listened, Roberto couldn't help but notice Samuel's little gestures that reminded him of his own son when he was young. The way he moved his hands as he spoke, the sparkle in his eyes when he mentioned something that excited him. They were reflections of a part of his family that he thought he had lost forever. "And you?" Samuel asked suddenly. "What do you like to do?" The question took him by surprise. He wasn't used to someone, especially someone so young, being interested in him like that. "Well, I guess I like to think about all the things I want back now," Roberto replied with a wistful smile. "I've been very busy working in the past, but lately, I think I'd rather spend time with the people who matter." Samuel nodded, though he seemed to process the comment carefully. Elisa, for her part, continued to watch them with a slight smile, as if she were enjoying that small moment of connection between two generations that she had dreamed of for so long. "My dad always says you're very stubborn," Samuel said with a light laugh, breaking the tension. Roberto joined in the laughter, surprised by how the comment, though simple, made him feel part of something again. "I guess you're right," he admitted. "But I think that might be a good thing, don't you?" Samuel laughed again, and for the first time Roberto felt the wall between them begin to crumble. Time seemed to stand still as the three shared the moment, and though the words were simple, each exchange was filled with meaning. Roberto knew that there was still a long way to go, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was moving in the right direction. When Samuel got up to go to the bathroom, Elisa and Roberto were alone for the first time since their unexpected reunion. The atmosphere changed, becoming more intimate and charged with unspoken emotions. Elisa looked away towards the window while playing with the edge of her glass. "I didn't expect to see you tonight, Roberto," she finally said in a calm but firm voice. "Neither do I, Elisa," he replied, his tone reflecting both surprise and vulnerability. "But here we are." Elisa nodded without taking her eyes off the window. "What brought you here?" he asked, although the answer seemed obvious. "My son. He invited me to meet Samuel." "You know what? I've never seen him before," Roberto admitted, letting the weight of guilt he carried show. "Many years have passed," Elisa murmured, looking back at him. Her eyes were filled with something difficult to define, a mixture of sadness, resignation, and something else, perhaps a vestige of affection buried beneath time and wounds. Roberto took a deep breath before answering. "Too many years, and not a single day goes by that I don't regret everything I left behind." Elisa looked at him in silence for a few seconds, as if evaluating the sincerity of his words. Then she looked down at the pendant she wore around her neck. "You still have it," Roberto said, pointing to the small necklace she was twirling between her fingers. "I could never get rid of it," Elisa admitted, though her voice carried a hint of melancholy. "It reminded me of a part of my life that was special." Roberto felt his heart sink. That necklace had been a gift he had given her on one of their anniversaries when they still believed they would spend the rest of their lives together. "I always thought you would have thrown it away," he said with a shy smile, trying to lighten the moment. "I thought about it," Elisa replied, with a slight smile that disappeared as quickly as it came. "But there are things that, no matter how much we want, we can't forget." The silence that followed was heavy, but not uncomfortable. It was as if they both understood that words could not encompass everything they felt. Roberto took advantage of the pause to look at her carefully. Despite the years, Elisa still had that serene elegance that had always captivated him. "I'm so sorry about everything that happened," he finally said, breaking the silence. Elisa looked at him with slightly narrowed eyes, as if trying to decide whether to believe him or not. "Do you regret leaving me, or do you regret what you lost afterwards?" she asked frankly, fixing her gaze on him. The question disarmed him. He had not expected such clarity, and yet he understood that it was fair. "I'm sorry about both of those things," he answered honestly. "I was selfish. I thought I was making the best decision for us, but now I see that I was only thinking about myself." Elisa didn't respond immediately. Her gaze softened slightly, but there was still a wall between them, one that wouldn't be easy to break down. "Samuel seems curious to meet you," she said, changing the subject, though her tone was still thick with emotion. "I hope you're prepared for what that entails." "I'll do my best to live up to expectations," Roberto replied, with a determination that Elisa couldn't ignore. Before they could say anything else, Samuel returned, interrupting their conversation. Elisa straightened up and regained her calm smile, while Roberto wondered how much more he could manage to repair that night. The tension in the air was palpable as Samuel sat back down. Although the young man didn't seem to notice the weight of what had happened between Roberto and Elisa during his absence, Roberto felt his heart still beating hard, as if the unspoken words with Elisa were building up inside him. Elisa, with her ability to manage emotions, changed the subject to something lighter. But Roberto knew that the time to talk about the past had come. He couldn't keep putting it off. "Samuel, could you give us a moment longer?" Roberto asked in a kind but firm tone. Samuel, although somewhat surprised, nodded. "Sure. I'll go order another dessert," he said, standing up with a smile. As Samuel walked away, Roberto turned his attention to Elisa, who was watching him with a mix of expectation and caution. "We need to talk about what happened," Roberto said directly, breaking any attempt at evasion. Elisa let out a deep sigh. "What good would it do, Roberto?" he asked, not harshly, but with resignation. "The past cannot be changed." "I know," he admitted, "but I've always carried this burden with me. I've asked myself over and over how I could have done things differently." Elisa looked down at the pendant, as if searching for the answer there. "It wasn't just your decision, Roberto. We both took different paths, and perhaps it was for the best." Roberto shook his head. "Maybe it was the best thing for you, but for me, it was the biggest mistake of my life." Elisa looked up, surprised by the frankness in his words. "Why are you saying this now?" he asked, as if trying to protect himself from what he knew he was about to hear. Roberto took a breath before answering. "Because I never stopped loving you." The words hung in the air. Elisa stared at him, as if searching for signs of lying on his face, but found none. "Roberto," she began, but her voice broke. "I know I can't erase what happened, Elisa, but I can't pretend I don't feel what I feel either," he continued with an intensity he couldn't control. Elisa took a deep breath, trying to compose herself. "What we had was beautiful, Roberto, but it's over too. And while part of me still remembers the good, the other part remembers the pain." "What if it doesn't have to end like this?" Roberto asked, almost in a whisper. Elisa looked at him sadly, but before she could answer, Samuel returned to the table with a plate in his hands. "What did I miss?" he asked with a smile, oblivious to the emotional charge floating between them. Elisa, always composed, put on her mask of serenity again. "Nothing important, Samuel. We were just reminiscing about some things from the past," she said, while Roberto tried to regain his composure. But the question was still there, latent in the air, waiting for its moment to be answered. The atmosphere at the table was a mix of apparent calm and contained emotions. Samuel, oblivious to the depth of the previous conversation, resumed his place and began to talk about his university and his future plans. Roberto listened attentively, but a part of him was still immersed in thoughts about Elisa and everything they had just shared. Finally, driven by a desire for honesty, Roberto decided to open up to his grandson. He looked at Samuel directly, sensing that this was the right moment. "Samuel, I want to tell you something," she said in a serious but warm tone. The young man looked at him curiously, putting his spoon aside. Elisa, who had remained silent, also turned her attention to Roberto, visibly uneasy. "What's wrong, Grandpa?" Samuel asked, intrigued. Roberto took a sip of water to gain time and gather his thoughts. Then he spoke calmly. "Many years ago, before your father was born, there was someone who had a profound impact on my life. That person was your grandmother, Elisa." Samuel frowned, clearly confused. "What do you mean?" "You two," he began, but stopped when he looked at Elisa, who remained silent. "Yes, Samuel. Elisa and I were together for a long time. We were more than friends, more than colleagues. We loved each other deeply, but things didn't turn out the way we expected," said Roberto in a tone that mixed nostalgia and regret. Elisa looked away towards the window, clearly excited but without intervening. Samuel, for his part, seemed to process the information. "So, you were a couple?" he finally asked with an air of disbelief. Roberto nodded. "That's right. "This necklace your grandmother is wearing," he continued, pointing at it, "was a gift I gave her on one of our anniversaries. It represented the promise of a future together." Samuel looked at the pendant with new eyes, as if it now had a completely different meaning. Elisa, who until then had avoided speaking, finally intervened. "Samuel, what your grandfather says is true, but life took us on different paths. Although we have always carried that time in our memories." Elisa spoke with a serenity that Roberto knew she had a hard time maintaining. Samuel, still absorbing what he had just heard, leaned back in his chair, looking at both of them with a mixture of astonishment and respect. "I would never have imagined something like this," he admitted, addressing the two. Roberto decided to take the opportunity to speak directly to his grandson from the heart. "Samuel, I want you to understand something. We all make mistakes in life, and sometimes those mistakes distance us from the people we love the most. But we also learn, and if we are lucky, life gives us a chance to make amends." Samuel looked at him intently, as if he were absorbing every word. "Do you think this is your chance?" he asked with a frankness that surprised Roberto. "It is, Samuel. With you, with your grandmother, with this family that I should never have abandoned." Elisa sighed deeply, moved by Roberto's sincerity, but without fully showing what she felt. Samuel, for his part, seemed to relax a little, as if he was finally beginning to accept the complexity of the story he was discovering. "Well, Grandpa," said Samuel with a slight smile, "I think it's always a good time to start over." Roberto felt enormous relief. That spark of understanding in his grandson's eyes was all he needed to reaffirm his decision not to let this second chance slip away. Elisa, although silent, also let out a small smile, as if she was beginning to see a light amidst the shadows of the past. The atmosphere at the table had changed. Emotions that had previously seemed heavy now flowed more naturally, as if the sincere exchange between Roberto, Elisa, and Samuel had broken down an invisible barrier. For the first time in a long time, Roberto felt like he was beginning to mend the broken pieces of his past. Samuel, intrigued by the story he had heard, dropped his reserved stance. He now looked at his grandfather with a mixture of curiosity and admiration. "Grandpa, what was it like for you, all this?" Samuel asked, breaking the silence with unexpected frankness. "I mean, losing someone so important and then being away from your family for so long." The question, though direct, was not in a tone of reproach, but of genuine curiosity. Roberto looked at him with a slight smile, although his eyes reflected the weight of the answer. "It was difficult, Samuel. Very difficult," he admitted with a deep sigh. "For years I tried to convince myself that I had made the right decisions. I thought that success in my life would come with career, would justify the sacrifices I made. But over time, I realized I was wrong." Elisa, who had remained silent, was watching him intently. Although she didn't say anything, her gaze showed a mixture of empathy and nostalgia. "Sometimes when you realize your mistakes, it's too late to correct them," Roberto continued. "But now sitting here with you two gives me a hope I haven't felt in a long time." Samuel nodded slowly, absorbing his grandfather's words. "I guess we all make mistakes, don't we?" the young man said, with a wisdom that surprised both adults. "But I also believe that there is always a way to move forward, even if we can't change the past." Samuel's words resonated with Roberto, filling him with a mixture of pride and relief. "You're right, Samuel," she replied with a sincere smile. "What matters is what we do with the second chances that life gives us." Elisa intervened for the first time in the conversation, her tone soft but firm. "Time waits for no one, Roberto. But sometimes, if we are lucky, it allows us to heal," she said, briefly looking at the pendant around her neck before turning her attention to Samuel. "And I believe that you, Samuel, are part of that healing for both of us." Samuel smiled, visibly moved by his grandmother's words. "Well, if that's true, then I want to help in any way I can," he said with a youthful determination that filled Elisa and Roberto with an unexpected warmth. For a moment, the three of them were silent, sharing a connection that went beyond words. It was as if each of them was reflecting on what this meeting represented, a chance to rebuild what was lost, to find a new purpose. Finally, Roberto spoke in a calm but determined tone. Elisa, Samuel, I want you to know that I will do everything I can to make up for lost time. I know I can't change the past, but I can be here now, for you. Elisa looked at him with a mixture of skepticism and hope, as if she wanted to believe his words but was still afraid of being hurt. That will depend on you, Roberto, she replied, her tone not harsh but realistic. Words are a good start, but it will be your actions that will show if you are really ready to change. Roberto nodded, accepting the challenge implicit in her words. Samuel, for his part, seemed satisfied with the honesty between the three of them. The moment was simple, but full of meaning. Elisa and Roberto shared a glance, and although they said nothing more, they both understood that this reunion was more than a coincidence. It was a chance to heal, and perhaps to start over. The night had advanced, and the restaurant was slowly beginning to empty out. However, at the table where Roberto, Elisa, and Samuel shared their time, the atmosphere was still warm, charged with emotions that were in no hurry to dissipate. For Roberto, the meeting had been more than a family reunion. It had been an open door to a new beginning. Samuel, full of youthful enthusiasm, spoke again, breaking the silence. Grandpa, do you think you could teach me more about our family? I'd like to know what my dad was like when he was little, and also about you. Roberto smiled, touched by his grandson's interest. Sure, Samuel. There are many stories I can tell you. Some are funny, some not so much, but they are all part of who we are. Samuel nodded with a smile. For him, meeting his grandfather meant filling a void he didn't know existed. Elisa watched them with a serene expression, as if just seeing them together was enough to give her peace. Roberto, Elisa intervened in a soft tone. I want you to know something. This meeting has not been easy for me. Roberto looked at her, attentive, knowing that her words carried a special weight. I know, Elisa, and I'm grateful that you're here, that you've allowed this to happen. Elisa took a deep breath, as if trying to gather the right words. Still, I'm glad I did. Samuel deserves to have you in his life, and I think maybe that was something I needed too. Roberto felt a lump in his throat. He had waited years to hear something like that, and although he knew there was still a lot to do, those words were an important step. Elisa looked at him directly, with a sincerity she had not shown all night. This doesn't mean everything is resolved, Roberto, but it does mean that I'm willing to try, for Samuel, and for us. Roberto nodded, unable to speak for a moment. His voice, when it finally came out, was soft but firm. Elisa, I can't change the past, but I promise I'll do whatever it takes to prove to you that I can be someone you trust again. Elisa gave him a slight smile, the one he had longed for. Although time and circumstances had separated them, at that moment, Roberto felt that something inside her had begun to give way. Samuel, unaware of the symbolism hanging in the air, intervened with his characteristic enthusiasm. So, Grandpa, when will we see each other again? Roberto laughed, appreciating the lightness that Samuel brought to the moment. Whenever you want, Samuel. This is just the beginning. Elisa also laughed softly as she grabbed her bag and began to gather her things. I think it's time for us to go, guys. It's been a long night, she said with a meaningful look at Roberto. The three of them got up from the table, and as they walked out of the restaurant together, Roberto felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope. At the entrance, Samuel said goodbye with a big hug to his grandfather, promising that he would call him soon. Elisa, for her part, paused for a moment before getting into the car. Good evening, Roberto, she said, and though her tone was formal, the look she gave him carried a silent promise. Good night, Elisa, he replied, knowing that the words left unsaid spoke louder than those that were. As he watched them leave, Roberto stood for a few minutes in the warm light of the street lamp, reflecting on what had happened. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of his past begin to lighten. There was much work to do, many wounds to heal, but there was also a path ahead of him, a path to redemption, to reconnection with his family, and perhaps to a new chapter with Elisa. With a serene smile, Roberto walked to his car, carrying with him a promise he had made to himself: to take advantage of every opportunity he had left, to make amends for the past and build a future closer to those he loved. Roberto's story teaches us that it is never too late to make amends for past mistakes and reconnect with those we love. Sometimes fate gives us a second chance, but it is up to us to take advantage of it. What would you have done in his place? Would you have dared to face your regrets and seek reconciliation? Reflect on your relationships and ask yourself if there is someone you should take that first step with. Click on the video on the screen to continue this exciting journey of self-discovery and learning. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories that will make you reflect on life and your decisions. See you in the next video.